So, about a week ago now, Mars Hydro offered me an SP150 LED grow light to give away to viewers of this channel. And in order to win it, you either had to leave a comment or email me. And in the comment or email, you had to give your best tip and mention the thing that you learnt most from watching this channel. So I've worked my way through, I don't know, nearly 100 comments and answered most of them. And it's actually been quite a lot of work, probably the hardest I've worked on a computer since I retired about 4 or 5 years ago. Anyway, I have picked a winner. And so the winner is Letty, and she lives up in Ambleside, which is in Cumbria, which is not that far away from me. Um, and her tip is to think of abundance in terms of diversity. And I really like that tip. I think that diversity has a lot of benefits, and she applies it in a few different ways. So obviously, a diverse range of food, but also a diverse range of planting times, and also a diverse range of planting locations. And I think if you do that, then you really can't go wrong, because if you get a pest in one batch of food in one place in the garden, you probably won't get it in another. If you have a diverse range of things planted in a single location, then you're not going to get as attractive a target for pests and diseases. If you plant at different times, then if you lose a crop through a freak weather event or again through disease or pests, then another follow-on crop probably won't get it. And as I said, if you've got a diverse diet, then you're really going to benefit health-wise. I think it's just a fantastic tip, and it's such a neat sort of encapsulation of lots of principles that I really like as well. I also, just as a counter, don't like to plant too diversely in a single location, just because I find it's quite difficult to manage the transition from one crop to another crop if there's all sorts of different things all in the same place. So when I do my interplants, I try and think carefully about making sure that the plants won't interfere with each other, but also that they'll all sort of gracefully finish at the same sort of point in time, and then the bed can be cleared and replanted with another set of interplants. Anyway, I think that's fantastic. Letty, I hope you really enjoy your grow light. So let's move on. So the first learning really is from Liz Croucher. And again, I really like this one. Well, I suppose of all my learnings from my channel, so it's not surprising that I like them. But this is to look at the harvest life cycle from a different perspective. And so she mentions quite a few examples of things that I really like to do. So one of them would be harvesting sprouts for the leaves, and then taking the sprout top off in July, and then harvesting the sprouts in July, and then taking that bed out and having a main crop sprout bed that you use for later as well. So that's a great example. Field beans are another great example where you're harvesting the leaves over winter, and then you could, in theory, but we don't do this, leave one of the shoots to grow on and then harvest that for beans later on in the season. And there are lots of examples of this, things like green garlic, where you're harvesting, you plant the garlic really densely and then harvest every other plant just for the stem and the monobulb when the plant is quite immature, and then leave the rest to grow on to mature to get your cloves for storage. So yeah, Liz Croucher, that was a really nice learning. And the next one I picked was from James Smith, and he talked about one of the things I really like, which is to keep things organised and tidy. Now, I'm a tidy person by nature, and I find it's very calming to the mind to be in a sort of tidy and ordered environment. And I'm on the Asperger's. I have Asperger's, which is on the autistic spectrum, and I just makes my life so much better when things are well ordered. But I'm actually not very well organized, as from a personality perspective, and so I use systems to create the organization for me, and I can kind of marshal a bit of enthusiasm to do a bit of work developing a system on a sort of wet and cold and windy day sometime in winter, and then I can take the advantage of that system all the way through the year when I've got absolutely no motivation to be organized myself. I'd much rather just be out on my bike or something. So yeah, James Smith, get organised, keep your plot tidy, really does pay dividends. And I'm a big believer as well that an organised plot is an efficient plot. So not only is it nice to look at, really peaceful and tranquil to work on, but you just grow more food. So yeah, I really like that. The next one I picked was from Tani, and she talks about one of my tricks, which is to grow cucamelons in hanging baskets. And this is just an illustration, I think, of how it's not just about what you grow, it's also how you grow it and trying to find things, that are really interesting, and just, more efficient. And to say, really like the cucamelons in hanging baskets. I like it for a few reasons. One is that you can just kind of pile the hanging baskets up in a corner whilst the plants are small, so they're not taking up any space or getting in the way. And then once they're sort of starting to grow and come over the sides of the hanging basket, then you can start to hang them up in the polytunnel. But the cucamelons just hang down, and it makes them really easy to harvest. And it makes a really big difference by comparison with having them growing up and into things and getting all over the place and tackled up with all the other plants that you've got in the polytunnel. So yeah, I really like a little tip, hanging baskets for cucamelons. So the next one I picked was from Steve Barrett, and he talks about what is learnt in terms of planting density and planting timings. He talks about the Brussels sprouts one as well, which is a very popular one in the comments. But I think generally getting your timings right and your planting density right is a real challenge when you're growing year round, because obviously the planting density changes depending on what you're trying to achieve. So if you're doing Brussels sprouts for the sprouts in winter, then you're planting one plant every 80 centimeters or thereabouts. Whereas if you're planting them for leaves very early in the spring, then you're talking about a planting density of 27 plants per square meter or thereabouts. I mean, you could go down to 18. You probably wouldn't go above 27. So that's a radically different planting density at a different time of year for a different purpose. And the same sort of thing holds for all sorts of different veggies. By varying the planting density, you can achieve completely different things with the plant. And another example might be beetroot, where if you're growing microgreens, you might have 200 microgreens in a space this big or something. Whereas if you're planting them for the roots, then you're talking about, I don't know, maybe say 1 every 4 inches or something. So yeah, and obviously if you're growing beetroot for the leaves for salads, for example, again you would plant them much closer together. If you're planting them for storage roots, then you might plant them individually. Whereas if you're planting them for harvesting throughout the season during summer, then you might module sow them and plant, 3 or 4 seeds in a module. So you get a nice continuous harvest, always picking the biggest root and letting the smaller ones grow on. So I think that is really important. And when it comes to timings, also this is hugely important. If you take a radish, for example, you might take you only 30 days in mid-spring to get the radish to maturity, whereas it might take 2.5 months to do the same thing in winter. And then James also, he had a nice comment, which was what he'd learnt in terms of eating more of the plant and eating the plant when it's not at its kind of showroom best. So an example of that might be purple sprouting broccoli when it started to bolt a little bit. Well, you wouldn't get that in the supermarket, but it tastes just fine. And so there's no problem with eating it. We really like actually blown sprouts. So that's something that I much prefer a blown sprout than a tight sprout. And of course, a blown sprout would be rejected by the supermarket. And so there's, loads and loads of examples of that. James actually talks about eating lettuce flowers and all sorts of different things. And I'm a big believer in that. And it just amazes me that so few people are aware that, for example, you can eat sprout leaves or you can eat purple sprouting broccoli leaves. In fact, purple sprouting broccoli is probably one of my favourite of all the leaves of the brassicas. And then Tamara mentioned something that she learned from the channel, which I really like as well, which is experimenting. And I think that, we don't I mean, they were kind of wild experiments, and I often do sort of, fairly wild experiments because I've got quite a lot of space and I can afford for a few things to go wrong. I can't afford for a lot of things to go wrong, so I don't go kind of crazy with my experiments, but I do like it. But also, I think it just plays to the fact that you're, you know, everybody's growing environment is different, and the microclimate that you have in different parts of your growing space as well is different. So often experiments are nothing more than asking yourself, can I grow these brassicas in this shady spot, or can I grow and extend the season of spinach by growing it under cover so that it gets more shade from the brassicas, for example. So there are lots of those types of experiments as well, where you're kind of fine tuning what you can grow where and when, depending on your microclimate. And then there are the crazy type of experiments, where you're doing something that has never been done before. And an example of that, going back into the past, probably would have been the Three Sisters method. I mean, who would have thought that you could grow squash and sweet corn and beans all in the same patch of land? I mean, I don't do that actually, but I do grow squash and sweet corn in the same patch of land. And so, experiments like that, I just think are really great, and they can really push the boundaries of what you can grow. And right now, one of the experiments that I'm really pushing the boundaries on is early baking potatoes. I'm trying to get baking potatoes in June because, as a self-sufficient gardener, one of the challenges is, what do you do when you really like something like baking potatoes, but you run out of them in March or April or something like that, and then traditionally you won't get them again until the middle of August? That's a long time to be without something that you really like in your diet. And so that often drives our experiments. And I think that it's actually one of the real benefits of the decision that we took to be self-sufficient, in that it provides this huge kind of motivation to push the boundaries so that you can actually not feel constrained at all by the fact that you made the decision to be self-sufficient, that you actually see it as, well, both a real stimulus to your kind of motivation to garden, but also that you're just not being constrained, that you've always got amazing food to eat every week of the year. And Letty, who won the competition, she also has a good answer on the things that she's learned. But one of the things she picks up on is how small things grow into big things. And I'm a big believer of that. And the philosophy generally is called Kaizen. And it basically is, try and find the smallest incremental improvement that you can and make sure you do that every day. And so you're always looking at, there's no kind of obstacle to progress if you always pick the smallest incremental improvement. But of course, over 365 days, small improvements grow into fairly substantial changes. And one of the commitments that we made to ourselves when we started the allotments is that we would reduce our workload on the allotments and in the back garden every year. We're getting older and we want to make sure that life is getting easier every year, not harder. That doesn't mean to say that we spend less time gardening, but that the amount of work that we put into it gets less and less every year. We might potter around and chat to people and have picnics and, just enjoy the environment and enjoy gardening and harvesting and cooking and all of that sort of thing. But we're actually doing less work every year. And that also means we've got more energy for hiking and cycling and other activities. So I really like this. Small incremental changes repeated again and again and again really add up. And then Dragon has a good thing that he's learned, which is the power of scheduling. And this is something that I've actually put a bit of effort into over the years to try and make sure that I've basically got succession planting and interplanting schemes that are easy to implement and very reliable, and that deliver measurably greater yields without any real downsides. And so, I do think it's worth kind of working quite hard on that, and that'll be different for everybody, because we all eat a different mix of food, and so the amount of extra food that you want to squeeze into the plot, is often different for each person. But for example, we really love spring onions. We eat spring onions almost every day of the year. Although I've had a couple of times when we've been short of them for a few weeks this year, so that's definitely a lesson learned for me. But so we interplant spring onions everywhere in order to get enough, because if we would have dedicated beds for them, well, obviously that would be um, reducing the yield in those beds. But by interplanting them, for example, into the lettuce beds, interplanting them into the spinach beds, basically just anywhere where I've got gaps, I just bung in spring onions. Then I'm actually not reducing the yield at all of the lettuce beds, but I'm increasing obviously the yield of the spring onions. And you can do that with everything. I was just thinking the other day that when I look at my winter sprouts and colettes, they've almost got no leaves on them now. So all they are is just a vertical stem, and that they're separated by quite long distances. So it's like vertical stems like this, and then all this ground with nothing on it. And I'm thinking, well, what a waste that is, And I was thinking, what could I plant in there? Well, of course, I could just plant field beans. And in fact, because I want to mulch that ground, so I could just scatter the field beans underneath the sprout plants, underneath the colette plants, and to some extent underneath purple sprouting broccoli, but not quite as much because they've still got quite a few leaves. So I scatter them under there, and then I just wheelbarrow my compost in, put an inch or 2 inches of compost on top of those field beans. So I don't even have to plant them. I'm just burying them basically under the compost. And up they'll come about now. So, late October, early November time, underneath those sprout plants. And it's almost like I don't have to stand on them to harvest. Then they'll grow away. They'll pump some nitrogen into the soil. Some of that nitrogen will get used by the sprouts and the colettes and the purple sprouting broccoli. And then come harvest time for the sprouts and the colettes, that is sort of late March, early April. That's when they're finishing. That's when I want to clear the field beans. So the whole bed just gets cleared at the same time. And there's no downsides to doing something like that. There's no work. You just throw in a few beans out there at the same time as you're doing your compost mulch. None of the plants suffer from any detriment. You're just getting an extra harvest. So it just works really well. So I'm always looking at those sorts of interplanting schemes. Another example might be to plant a nice slow growing crop like lamb's lettuce. So you could plant that underneath your brassicas as well in the winter. Now, of course, you could do similar sorts of things later on in the season, planting low growing crops underneath your brassicas. Lots of people use lettuces. Or beetroot, all sorts of things as well. So anyway, that was Dragon's learning all about interplanting and successional sowings and plantings. And then finally, the thing that Susie picked, which she learned, was all about extending the season and the impact of temperature on growth. And the rule of thumb to use here is that for every 10 degrees centigrade increase in temperature above about 4 degrees, you get a doubling of growth. And that's a really useful thing to remember. And it's the thing that differentiates really growing under cover and growing outside, or different types of cover. Things like, say, lettuces might survive outside and you might be able to harvest them all year round outside. But if you grow them under cover, you might get 1.5, 15 degrees of extra temperature. And if you do that, then you're getting a tripling of growth rate. So you're tripling the yield of those plants. And it may even be an underestimate, because if you grow outside, quite a lot of the energy of the plant the plant is generating is used to combat the stresses that it's experiencing because of the elements. So that's heavy rain and heavy, strong winds and things like that. All of that takes energy for the plant to combat, just like it would if you were outside in that environment. Whereas if you're in a nice controlled environment like a coal frame or a polytunnel, not only are you getting the temperature boost, but you're not getting the wind stress and you're not getting the rain stress. And so you might get 4 times the growth rate in those controlled environments that you would get outside. So thanks, Susie, for reminding me about that one. So now we're on to the tips. And the first one I've got here is from Paula. And she talks about the importance of cleaning the greenhouse, especially in spring, to make sure that plants are exposed to the maximum amount of light when they're in that controlled environment. And that results in means that the plants get adapted to high light levels, and so when you take them outside, they're less likely to be scorched by the sun. Whereas if you've got a dirty old greenhouse after winter, then they're in this much more sheltered environment, and so when you then take them out, they're likely to get scorched. And so that's a really interesting tip, and these are the types of tips that I've tried to pick, things that often I've never heard before. And so they're a bit obscure, and some of them are kind of a bit weird. So the next one is from Emily, and she says that she went to the garden centre and she got some garlic, and the guy in the garden centre said, "Plant your garlic in sand." Just a bit dubious about that, like I would be. Anyway, she planted it in sand, and she said she got the best garlic crop from those garlic that she'd ever had, much better than the ones that she planted in the ground. And I've heard people talk similar sorts of things about carrots, and so it just got me thinking. It's a bit weird, and I don't really understand why. If anybody does understand why, put an answer in the comments of this video. But it's certainly something to experiment with, and we all like to experiment. So the next one is from Dragon, and he also featured in the things that he'd learnt section. And he talks about growing his chilies. Now, he grows his chilies in pots, what he calls large pots, which are about 6 inches wide at the top and about 10 inches deep. So they're a reasonably sized pot. But rather than follow conventional advice, which is to water and then let them dry out a bit and then water, etc., he just puts his in a tray and fills that tray with about 2 centimeters of water and basically just keeps it topped up with about 2 centimeters all the time. And he says, provided they're in a hot environment, like a greenhouse or a polytunnel, then they just thrive like that. He's had a really good crop and he's never worrying about his chilies drying out. It's a really good tip, isn't it? And, a lot of people might think, well, maybe they would rot or suffer, but Dragon says, no, they do really great like that. So the next one I really like, this one was from Little Petite Wheat, and he says that he plants his broad beans, aquadulce, 6 inches deep, which is pretty deep, on the 5th of November, which is actually, well, it's not that late, but it's fairly late for broad beans. And as a result, they spend a lot of time putting down really good roots, and they come up quite late in the season. And so they're not big plants over winter. So I don't know exactly what size they are because he didn't say. But I suspect that they're only about this sort of size as they come out of winter in February. But they've got really strong roots. They're nice, stocky plants. And, they're not damaged at all by winter. And then come spring, they'll fly away. And he gets a nice early crop without any losses. And I think this is a great tip. I've always thought that with broad beans, a lot of people plant them way too early, and they've got plants sort of this sort of size coming into winter, and they've got to stake them, and they're getting battered really badly by the winds. And as a result, the plants are just not very healthy when they come into spring, and so you don't get as good a crop. So I really like this tip. I've not tried planting them quite so deep. But yeah, I reckon it works. It's worth giving it a go, I think, especially if you live in a windy location like we do. So the next tip's from Alicia, and she talks about putting sponge at the bottom of your containers. And this acts as a nice water reservoir, as well as stopping all the soil coming out of the bottom of the holes. And she says that she's done comparative experiments where she's had some containers with sponge, some without sponge, and the ones with sponge have always had a better yield and healthier plants. And it seems really simple. She's even tried it with potatoes and noticed a better yield from them. So I think I might give this one a go. I think it's a pretty clever idea. So that's sponge at the bottom of your containers. And I really like this one from Orla, which is to put a comfy cushion in your polytunnel to encourage local cats to come in and keep the mice population down. And I actually have a cat that, well, I've got two cats at home, but I've got one cat that comes onto into the polytunnel and the allotment. It squeezes through the door no matter how closely I've got it closed. And yeah, it just curls up in the polytunnel, and I'll walk in there in the morning, I'll shoot out. But yeah, I really like having that cat in there. So I've not actually thought about it in terms of a mouse catcher. I just like the company sometimes. But yeah, what a nice tip. I like that one. Well done, Orla. And then finally, I really like people recommending varieties, especially the ones that they really love. And for me, this is one of the things I'm always doing on my channel as well. So it's really nice to share varieties. And Martha has a nice selection of varieties that she's shared as well. Some really nice tasting squashes. And she just described them really beautifully. So thanks for that, Martha. And she's offered to send me some as well, which is extra special credit there, Martha. Anyway, I think that's it. So hope you enjoyed this quick video. Hope Letty really enjoys her grow light, and she lives in Cumbria and it can be a bit cloudy and dark and rainy up there. So I think grow lights will come in really handy. My name's Steve. This is the Seaside Allotment channel, and I'll see you soon.